Sarah Johnson felt the warm Los Angeles sun on her face as she walked toward the private terminal at LAX airport. Her high heels clicked against the pavement, and her dark blue business suit looked perfect, just like always. She had worked hard to get where she was. The CEO of Tech Future, one of America's biggest technology companies. At age 45, Sarah had already changed the tech world. She started as a simple computer programmer 20 years ago, working late nights and early mornings. Now, she was worth millions and had just finished a big deal to buy another company. That's why she was at the airport, to fly home on her company's private jet. The morning was quiet at the private terminal. Only a few expensive cars were parked outside, and Sarah's driver had just left after dropping her off. She carried her favorite brown leather bag, which held her laptop and the papers from today's big deal. Her dark curly hair was tied back neatly, and she wore small gold earrings that her mother had given her for graduation. As Sarah reached the terminal door, she saw the security guard. His name tag said Richard Walsh, and he looked about 50 years old with graying hair. As soon as he saw her, his face changed. He quickly stepped in front of the door, blocking her way. "Excuse me, miss," he said in a rude voice, "but this is a private terminal. The regular airport entrance is that way." He pointed toward the main terminal building, not even asking to see her ID or papers. Sarah had seen this look before. She had dealt with people like Walsh throughout her career, people who took one look at her skin color and made wrong assumptions. But Sarah never let their ignorance stop her. She had learned to handle these situations with grace. Instead of getting angry, Sarah smiled. She reached into her leather bag calmly and took out her identification and flight papers. But before she could show them to Walsh, she heard familiar voices behind her. "Sarah, wait up," called Marcus Chen, her chief financial officer. He was walking up with 5 other executive team members, all heading to the same board meeting in New York. They were a diverse group, different races, ages, and backgrounds. That's how Sarah had built her company, choosing the best people no matter what they looked like. At the same time, the terminal supervisor, Mrs. Rodriguez, came running out. She had seen Sarah through the window and knew exactly who she was. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," she said warmly. "Your jet is ready, and the crew is waiting. Would you like some coffee before takeoff?" Walsh's face turned red, his mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He suddenly realized that the woman he had tried to turn away wasn't just allowed to be there. She owned the jet parked outside. Sarah looked at Walsh calmly. Instead of demanding that he be fired, which she could have done easily, she saw a chance to teach an important lesson. "Mr. Walsh," she said quietly, "would you walk with me for a moment?" They moved to a quiet corner of the terminal. Sarah spoke softly but firmly. "I know you were trying to do your job," she said, "but you made assumptions about me based on how I look. That's not right, and it's not professional. Everyone who comes through these doors deserves the same respect, no matter their skin color, gender, or appearance." Walsh looked down at his shoes, his face still red with shame. "I'm very sorry, Ms. Johnson," he whispered. "I was wrong. This will never happen again." Sarah nodded. "I believe you," she said. "But I want you to do something for me. Remember this moment. Remember how it feels to realize you judged someone unfairly. Use this experience to do better in the future." As Sarah walked toward her jet with her team, she heard Walsh talking to Mrs. Rodriguez, asking about getting more training for the security team about treating everyone fairly. Sarah smiled to herself. Sometimes the best way to fight prejudice wasn't through anger or punishment, but through teaching and understanding. The morning sun sparkled on her jet's silver wings as Sarah climbed the stairs. She had turned what could have been an ugly moment into a chance for positive change. That's why she was such a successful leader. She knew how to transform problems into opportunities, just like she had done so many times before in her remarkable journey to the top. The story of what happened at LAX spread quickly through the business world. Within a week, Sarah Johnson's quiet response to discrimination had become a powerful example for others. News websites wrote about it, and business magazines wanted to interview her. But Sarah wasn't interested in becoming famous for this incident. She wanted to create real change. Back at her company's headquarters in San Francisco, Sarah sat in her large office on the top floor. Through the wide windows, she could see the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. On her desk were 3 framed photos. One of her parents at their small bookstore, another of her graduating from college, and a third of her opening the new Tech Future building. "Ms. Johnson, your 10 o'clock appointment is here," said her assistant through the phone. Sarah smiled, knowing who it was. She had invited Richard Walsh, the security guard from LAX, to meet with her. After their brief talk at the airport, she had thought a lot about how to turn this incident into something positive. Walsh walked into her office nervously. He looked different now, wearing a suit instead of his security uniform. His hands were shaking slightly as he sat down in front of Sarah's desk. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Walsh," Sarah said kindly. "I know it's a long trip from Los Angeles." She noticed he couldn't quite meet her eyes, still feeling ashamed about what had happened. "Ms. Johnson, I can't tell you how sorry I am," Walsh began. "I haven't been able to sleep well since that day. I keep thinking about how wrong I was, how unfair." Sarah raised her hand gently to stop him. "I didn't ask you here for more apologies," she explained. "I have an idea, and I'd like your help." She turned her computer screen so Walsh could see it. On it was a plan for a new training program, not just for the airport, but for all kinds of companies. It would teach people about treating everyone fairly and with respect. "Your experience, Mr. Walsh, could help others learn," Sarah said. "Would you be willing to tell your story as part of this training? To explain how you realized your mistake and decided to change?" Walsh sat up straighter, surprised. "You want me to help, even after what I did?" Sarah nodded. "Sometimes the best teachers are people who have learned from their mistakes. Your story is powerful because it's honest. It shows that anyone can learn and change." As they talked more, Walsh began to understand. He shared how he had grown up in a small town where everyone looked the same, how he had never really thought about his own prejudices until that day at the airport, how meeting Sarah had changed everything he thought he knew. While they spoke, Sarah's team brought in lunch. They'd all sat together, the CEO and the security guard, sharing sandwiches and ideas about how to make the training program work. Walsh had good suggestions about reaching other security workers, and Sarah's team took careful notes. By the end of the meeting, the training program had a name: Open Gates, Open Minds. It would start at LAX but soon spread to other airports, companies, and organizations. Walsh would be one of the main speakers, sharing his story to help others recognize and change their own biases. As Walsh got ready to leave, Sarah handed him a business card. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Real change happens slowly, one person at a time, but it does happen." Walsh took the card carefully. "You know," he said, his voice emotional, "when I came to your office today, I expected to lose my job. Instead, you're giving me a chance to help fix the problem. I don't understand why you're being so kind to me." Sarah walked with him to her office door. "Mr. Walsh, in my life, I learned that anger doesn't solve problems. Understanding does. You made a mistake, yes, but you're willing to learn from it and help others learn too. That's what matters." After Walsh left, Sarah stood by her office window, thinking. Her parents had always taught her that education was the best way to fight prejudice. Now, she was using her position and power not for revenge, but to create positive change. The incident that could have ended with anger was instead becoming the start of something important. Sarah smiled as she watched the sun reflect off the bay waters. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was turning a bad moment into a chance to make the world a little bit better. 3 months had passed since the incident at LAX, and the Open Gates, Open Minds program was growing bigger than anyone had expected. Sarah Johnson sat in a large conference room at the Chicago airport, watching as Richard Walsh finished telling his story to a group of 50 security workers. The room was completely quiet. Everyone was paying attention. "I thought I was just doing my job that day," Walsh said, his voice clear and honest. "But I was really just showing my own prejudices. Thanks to Ms. Johnson, I learned that being a good security guard means treating everyone with respect, no matter what they look like." After the talk, many security workers came up to shake Walsh's hand. Some shared their own stories about times they had judged people unfairly. Sarah watched from the back of the room, feeling proud of how far Walsh had come. He was no longer the nervous man who had visited her office. Now he was a confident speaker helping others learn. That evening, Sarah's phone rang. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, the supervisor from LAX. "Ms. Johnson, you won't believe what happened today," she said excitedly. "Remember Jason Chen, That young businessman you helped last week when another passenger was being rude to him. Well, he just donated $1 million to expand the training program. Sarah remembered Jason well. He was a young Asian American tech entrepreneur who had faced discrimination at the airport. Instead of getting angry, Sarah had stepped in and handled the situation calmly, just like she had with Walsh. Now Jason wanted to help spread the message of respect and understanding. The next morning, Sarah met with her team in their Chicago hotel. Marcus Chen, her chief financial officer, had good news. 10 more airports want to start the program, he said, showing her the list. And it's not just airports anymore. Banks, hotels, and stores are asking for the training too. Sarah looked at the numbers on Marcus's tablet. The program had already trained over 1,000 people. Comments from participants showed that it was making a real difference. Security incidents were down, and customer satisfaction was up. But what made Sarah happiest were the personal stories. Like the young black woman who wrote to thank her, saying she no longer felt nervous at airport security. Or the elderly Asian couple who said security guards had started greeting them with smiles instead of suspicious looks. Later that day, Sarah visited a small airport in Wisconsin. As she walked through the terminal, a security guard named Mike stopped her. "Ms. Johnson," he said, "I took your training program last month. Yesterday, I almost stopped a woman because she didn't look like her passport photo. But I remembered what Mr. Walsh said about not making assumptions. Turns out she had just changed her hair color. She was so happy that I treated her with respect." Sarah smiled, remembering her own experience with Walsh. "That's exactly what the program is about," she said. "Small changes in how we treat people can make a big difference." Back in her hotel room that night, Sarah called her parents. They had taught her about dignity and respect while running their small bookstore in Atlanta. Now their daughter was teaching these same values to people across the country. "You turned something bad into something good," her mother said proudly. "Just like your father did when those people tried to stop him from opening the bookstore in that white neighborhood. You didn't get angry. You invited them in for coffee and books instead." Sarah looked out her hotel window at the city lights. Her father's way of handling prejudice had shown her that education was better than anger. Now she was using her position as a successful CEO to spread that message. The next morning's newspaper had a small article about the training program. It mentioned how a chance encounter between a CEO and a security guard had led to positive changes across the country. Sarah smiled as she read it. Sometimes the biggest changes started with small moments. As she packed her bag for her next flight, Sarah thought about Walsh and all the other people who had become part of this movement. The incident that could have ended with anger and punishment had instead created a wave of positive change. It proved what Sarah had always believed, that most people wanted to do better, they just needed someone to show them how. 6 months after the lax incident, Sarah Johnson stood on stage at a national business conference in New York. The huge room was filled with CEOs, business leaders, and journalists. They had all come to hear about how a simple airport incident had turned into one of the country's most successful anti-discrimination programs. "Success isn't just about making money," Sarah said into the microphone. "It's about making a difference." Behind her, a large screen showed pictures from training sessions across the country. One photo showed Richard Walsh speaking to a group of police officers. Another showed airport security teams practicing new ways to treat passengers fairly. But not everyone liked the changes Sarah was making. As she left the stage, she heard two older CEOs talking. "She's just doing this for attention," one whispered. "It's all about looking good for the media." Sarah had heard comments like these before. Some people thought she was wasting company time and money on the training program. They didn't understand why a tech company CEO was worried about airport security and discrimination. That afternoon, Sarah had a meeting with her company's board of directors. Some board members were concerned about how much time she was spending on the Open Gates, Open Minds program. "Ms. Johnson," said Mr. Thompson, one of the oldest board members, "Tech Future is a technology company, not a social justice organization. Maybe it's time to let someone else run this program." Sarah stayed calm, just like she had with Walsh that day at LAX. She opened her laptop and showed them the numbers. Company profits were up 25% since the program started. Employee satisfaction had improved. More talented people wanted to work for Tech Future because they respected its values. This program isn't just about doing good, Sarah explained. It's about good business. When companies treat people with respect, everyone benefits. After the meeting, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a message from Walsh with exciting news. A major television network wanted to make a documentary about the program. They would show how one moment of discrimination had led to positive changes across America. Sarah smiled as she remembered how nervous Walsh had been in her office 6 months ago. Now he was helping lead a national movement. The security guard who had once blocked her from boarding her own plane was teaching others about respect and fairness. That evening, Sarah visited a small coffee shop near her hotel. As she waited in line, she noticed the young cashier was wearing a familiar pin, the Open Gates, Open Minds logo. Sarah had designed it herself, a simple gate opening into a bright sun. "I love your pin," Sarah said when it was her turn to order. The cashier, a young Asian woman named Amy, smiled brightly. "Thanks. We all wear them here. Our manager took the training program last month, and now our whole coffee shop feels different. We learned how to make everyone feel welcome, no matter who they are." As Sarah sat with her coffee, she thought about how far the program had come. It had started with one incident at an airport, but now it was changing how people treated each other in shops, schools, and offices across the country. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Mrs. Rodriguez from LAX. "Ms. Johnson, guess what? The airport manager who didn't want to start the training program just apologized. He said he was wrong. After seeing how much better things are running, he wants to expand the program to all the terminals." Sarah looked out the coffee shop window at the busy New York street. People of all backgrounds walked past: business people, tourists, workers, students. Each person had their own story, their own experiences with being judged unfairly. But things were slowly changing. The training program was teaching people to look past their first impressions, to treat everyone with the same respect. It wasn't always easy, and some people still resisted the changes. But Sarah knew that real change took time. As she finished her coffee, Sarah thought about her next steps. The program was growing, but there was still so much work to do. Tomorrow, she would fly to Boston for another training session. The incident that could have made her angry had instead given her a chance to change thousands of lives. 1 year had passed since the incident at LAX, and Sarah Johnson sat in her San Francisco office, reading a special email. The President of the United States wanted to honor her and Richard Walsh at the White House for their work in fighting discrimination. The Open Gates, Open Minds program had grown bigger than anyone had imagined. "Can you believe it?" Walsh said during their video call. "From me being a prejudiced security guard to getting invited to the White House. Life sure can change in a year." His face on Sarah's computer screen showed both excitement and disbelief. But just as Sarah was about to reply, Marcus Chen rushed into her office. "Sarah, we have a problem," he said, looking worried. "Someone's trying to copy our program, but they're doing it wrong. They're using harsh methods and making people feel bad about themselves. It's causing problems at several airports." Sarah turned back to her computer screen. "Walsh, we need to handle this. Can you fly out tomorrow?" Walsh nodded, understanding the urgency. This was the challenge they had feared. People using their program's name, but missing its true message of understanding and respect. The next day, Sarah and Walsh visited Atlanta Airport, where the fake program had caused trouble. Security staff there were confused and upset. The copycat trainers had used shame and blame instead of understanding and education. "I felt terrible after their session," one security officer told Sarah. "They just made us feel like bad people instead of helping us learn and improve." Other staff members nodded in agreement. Sarah stood up in front of the group. "The real Open Gates, Open Minds program isn't about making people feel bad," she explained. "It's about helping everyone do better. Remember how Mr. Walsh shared his story? He showed us that anyone can learn and change." Walsh stepped forward and spoke to the security team. "When Ms. Johnson caught me being prejudiced, she could have had me fired. Instead, she taught me to be better. That's what this program is really about, learning and growing, not shame and blame." After the meeting, Sarah's phone kept ringing with calls from other airports facing similar problems. Some places had hired untrained people who claimed to teach the program. Others had changed the message to be more aggressive and accusatory. That evening, in her hotel room, Sarah worked late with her team to find a solution. They decided to create an official certification process. Only trained instructors could teach the real program, and they had to follow strict guidelines about treating everyone with respect. "We need to protect what makes our program special," Sarah told her team. "It's not just about stopping discrimination, it's about bringing people together and helping them understand each other better." The next morning, Sarah visited her parents' old bookstore, now run by her younger sister. The store had always been a place where everyone felt welcome, no matter who they were. This was where Sarah had first learned about treating people with respect. "Remember when that angry man came to the store?" her sister asked as they had coffee. Dad didn't argue with him. He just asked him to sit and talk. By the time he left, he had bought 3 books and made a friend. Sarah smiled at the memory. That was the spirit she wanted to keep in her program, the power of talking and understanding instead of fighting and blaming. Back at the airport, Sarah and Walsh met with the security team again. This time, they did a proper training session, showing the real way the program worked. They shared stories, listened to concerns, and helped everyone feel comfortable asking questions. "This is so different from the other training," one officer said afterward. "Now I understand how to do my job better while treating everyone fairly. It's not about being perfect, it's about being better every day." As Sarah packed up to leave, she saw Walsh talking quietly with a young security guard who had been particularly upset by the FATE program. They were both smiling now, sharing experiences and ideas. That's when Sarah knew they would solve this problem, just like all the others. The FATE programs might cause temporary confusion, but the real message of understanding and respect would always be stronger. On the flight home, Sarah wrote thank you notes to everyone who had helped protect the program's true mission. The White House ceremony would be nice, but this was the real victory, keeping their message of positive change alive and genuine. The day of the White House ceremony arrived bright and clear. Sarah Johnson stood in front of her hotel mirror in Washington, D.C., adjusting her navy blue suit. Next door, Richard Walsh was probably just as nervous, getting ready for the biggest day of his life. A year and a half ago, Walsh had been a security guard who made wrong assumptions about people. Now he was about to receive a national award for helping change how Americans treated each other. Life could change in surprising ways. "Ms. Johnson?" There was a knock at her door. It was Marcus Chen, holding a tablet. "You should see this." He showed her a news article about airports across Europe wanting to start the Open Gates, Open Minds program. Their simple story of learning and change was spreading around the world. In the hotel lobby, Sarah met Walsh and his family. His teenage daughter hugged Sarah tightly. "Thank you for not being angry at my dad that day," she whispered. "You changed his life. He's a different person now." The White House was bigger than Walsh had imagined. As they walked through security, the guards recognized them. "Your program made me a better officer," one guard said proudly, showing them his Open Gates, Open Minds pin. Before the ceremony, Sarah and Walsh waited in a beautiful room with tall windows. Other award winners were there too, people who had helped make America better in different ways. Walsh looked nervous, pulling at his tie. "Relax," Sarah said kindly. "Just tell your story like you always do. That's what makes our program work. Honest stories about real change." The ceremony began in the East Room. The president spoke about how small moments could lead to big changes. He told the story of what happened at LAX, how Sarah's response to discrimination had started a movement. Instead of responding to prejudice with anger, the president said, "Ms. Johnson chose understanding. Instead of punishing Mr. Walsh, she helped him learn." Together, they show us that positive change is possible when we treat each other with respect. Sarah and Walsh walked up to receive their awards, but they had a surprise for the president. They asked if they could share something special. Last week, Sarah explained to the audience, "We trained our 10,000th person, but more importantly, we received this letter." She held up a piece of paper. "It's from a young black girl who wants to be a pilot. She wrote that because of our program, airport security officers now treat her with respect when she goes to her flying lessons. She's not afraid anymore." Walsh stepped forward. "And I have something to share too," he said. "My daughter just got accepted to law school. She told me she wants to help fight discrimination, just like Ms. Johnson did. My mistake led to something good because someone chose to teach instead of punish." After the ceremony, there was a reception in the White House garden. People from all over the country came to congratulate Sarah and Walsh. Many shared their own stories about how the program had helped them or changed their thinking. A group of airline CEOs asked Sarah about expanding the program to their international flights. Police chiefs wanted to use it in their departments. School principals thought it could help teachers and students. The program works because it's about understanding, not blame, Sarah explained to them. When people feel respected, they want to learn and change. Later that evening, Sarah and Walsh sat quietly in the hotel restaurant. The excitement of the day was over, but their work wasn't finished. Tomorrow, they would fly to different cities to continue their training sessions. "You know what I realized today?" Walsh said, looking at his award. "That day at LAX, when I was rude to you, I could have ruined my life. Instead, you helped me become a better person. Now I get to help others do the same." Sarah smiled, remembering that morning at the airport. "That's the real message of our program," she said. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow. Change doesn't happen through anger or punishment. It happens through understanding and respect." Outside, the Washington Monument glowed in the dark. Sarah thought about all the people who had helped spread their message of positive change. The award was nice, but the real reward was knowing they were making a difference, one person at a time. 2 years after the LAX incident, Sarah Johnson found herself standing in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. She wasn't there as a tourist. She was about to launch the European version of Open Gates, Open Minds. The program that started with one security guard in Los Angeles had crossed the ocean. Richard Walsh stood beside her, looking amazed at how far they'd come. "Did you ever think we'd be here?" he asked, adjusting the translator earpiece he would use for his speech. "From LAX to Paris. It doesn't seem real." Inside the conference center, representatives from airports across Europe waited to hear their story. But this time was different. They had learned that each country needed its own version of the program, one that respected local cultures while keeping the core message of understanding. "The problems might look different in different places," Sarah explained to the crowd, "but the solution is always the same, treating everyone with respect." The translator repeated her words in French, German, and Spanish as heads nodded in agreement. A French airport director stood up to share a story. Last month, a Muslim woman had been treated badly at security because of her hijab. "We need your program," he said. "We need to learn how to keep our airports safe while respecting everyone's dignity." Walsh's speech touched many hearts, even through translation. He told his story of prejudice and change, but added something new. He talked about how the program had changed his whole family. His daughter was now in law school, fighting discrimination. His son had started a similar program at his high school. During lunch, Sarah received exciting news from Marcus Chen back in America. A major tech company wanted to donate money to make the program free for smaller airports and police departments. They would call it the Open Gates Scholarship. "This means we can reach places that couldn't afford the training before," Sarah told Walsh excitedly. "Small towns, rural areas, places that really need help with understanding different cultures." That afternoon, they visited Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport to meet the security team. Many officers there had never worked with people from different backgrounds. Some were nervous about making mistakes or saying the wrong thing. "It's okay to be unsure," Walsh told them, speaking through a translator. "I was more than unsure, I was wrong, but being wrong isn't the end. It's a chance to learn and grow." Sarah watched as the French security officers started to relax and share their own stories. One man talked about judging travelers by their clothes. Another admitted she felt uncomfortable with languages she didn't understand. Just like in America, honest conversations were the first step toward change. Back at her hotel that evening, Sarah had a video call with her parents. They were proud, but not surprised by how far the program had spread. "You always had a way of turning problems into solutions," her father said. "Just like when you helped that young man in your computer class who everyone else ignored. Now he runs his own tech company." Sarah looked out her hotel window at the Paris lights. Tomorrow they would fly to Berlin, then Rome, then Madrid. Each city would need its own approach, its own way of teaching respect and understanding. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Rodriguez at LAX. The officer who had replaced Walsh was doing an amazing job. She had started a mentoring program for new security officers, teaching them from day one how to treat everyone fairly. "See how far kindness can spread," Walsh said later as they planned the next day's training. "You could have had me fired that day, Instead, you started something that's changing the world. Sarah smiled, remembering that morning at LAX. She had been angry at first, but she chose a different path. Now that choice was helping people everywhere learn to see past their prejudices. A group of European airport directors had invited them to dinner to discuss the program. As Sarah and Walsh walked through the Paris streets, they passed people from all over the world. Tourists, workers, students, families. Everyone deserving respect. Everyone able to learn and change. You know what's amazing? Walsh said as they reached the restaurant. That moment when I was worst at my job became the moment that helped me do it better than ever. All because you believed people could change. 5 years had passed since that morning at LAX when a security guard blocked Sarah Johnson from boarding her private jet. Now, Sarah stood in front of a large crowd at the United Nations in New York. She was there to receive a special award for creating positive change around the world. Richard Walsh sat in the front row with his family. His daughter had finished law school and now helped run the Open Gates, Open Minds program in Asia. His son taught the program in high schools. A mistake that could have ruined his career had instead created a legacy of understanding. 5 years ago, Sarah began her speech. I faced discrimination at an airport. I could have responded with anger. I could have demanded punishment. Instead, I chose understanding. That choice changed not just my life, thousands of others. The huge screen behind her showed numbers that seemed impossible. 1 million people trained in 15 countries. Airports, schools, companies, and police departments around the world now used their program. But Sarah was most proud of the personal stories. She told the crowd about Maria, a cleaner at Madrid airport, who used the program to help other workers understand and respect different cultures. About Chen Wei, a security officer in Beijing, who changed how his team treated international travelers. About Ahmed, a student in Dubai, who brought the program to his university. But the biggest change, Sarah said, looking at Walsh, started with one security guard who was willing to learn from his mistake. Mr. Walsh could have denied his prejudice or made excuses. Instead, he chose to grow and help others grow too. Walsh smiled, remembering how nervous he'd been that first day in Sarah's office. Now he traveled the world, sharing his story and teaching others. His grandchildren wore little Open Gates pins proudly, understanding even at their young age what their grandfather taught about respect. After the ceremony, Sarah received news that made her smile. The small airport where she'd first faced discrimination as a young pilot 20 years ago had just started using their program. The circle was complete. The place where she first experienced prejudice was now teaching respect and understanding. That evening, Sarah hosted a special dinner. She had invited the first 100 people they had trained 5 years ago. Many were now teachers of the program themselves. They shared stories about how their lives had changed since learning to see past their prejudices. Remember how scared we were to talk about these things? One former security officer said, "Now we help others face their own prejudices without shame. We show them that change is possible." Mrs. Rodriguez from LAX was there too. She had amazing news. Security complaints at her terminal had dropped to 0 last month. "Every officer wears the Open Gates pin," she said proudly. "But more importantly, they live by what it means." Later that night, Sarah walked through Times Square with Walsh and his family. The giant screens showed news about their UN award, but they were focused on something else. A street vendor, seeing Walsh's pin, started telling them how the program had helped his daughter feel safer at her airport job. "That's what it's all about," Sarah said quietly. "Not the big awards or ceremonies, but the real changes in people's lives." Walsh nodded. "You know what I learned from all this?" he said. "Change isn't just about stopping bad things from happening. It's about creating good things instead. You didn't just stop me from being prejudiced. You helped me become someone who makes things better." As they walked back to their hotel, Sarah thought about that morning at LAX 5 years ago. She had been angry at first, hurt by Walsh's prejudice. But by choosing understanding over anger, she had started something powerful. The program would keep growing, reaching new places and changing more lives. But its heart would stay the same, the simple idea that everyone deserves respect and anyone can learn to be better. 5 years, Walsh said as they reached the hotel. 5 years since I made the biggest mistake of my life, and you turned it into the best thing that ever happened to me. Sarah smiled. "Sometimes," she said, "our worst moments can lead to our best changes. All we need is the courage to learn and the kindness to help others learn too.